Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. How did they know?
We're continuing our series on strange stories in the Bible. And this is, there's a lot of strange stories in the Bible. I was thinking about this. There's a lot. But this is one of the more strange ones. And it's interesting how it shows up several different places in the Bible. So here we have the Christmas story, and you all are familiar with the wise men from the east. Normally, it's represented as three wise men, although you'll notice it doesn't say how many there were. It just says plural, wise men from the east. And it does mention three gifts that they brought. And so traditionally, it's been thought that there were three of them. And they came from the east. When you think about the East, it's interesting. Even today, in our Western civilization, there's this sort of mysterious thing about the wise men from the East, and a lot of people study the different gurus and teachers of the East. Well, of course, for us, they're actually west of us. If you go west to get to Asia from here, unless you go around the other way, but that's the long way around, right? So they're really west, but it's east. Anyway, so the wise men, they came from the east, and we don't know exactly where these wise men came from, but the general idea is that they probably came from somewhere in the Euphrates River area. There was a long history of wise men and astrologers and soothsayers in that area of the world. You remember the story of Daniel, right? In Babylon, that was east from Israel, east from Jerusalem, across the desert over in the Euphrates River Valley. And so we're not going to go into that story, but you remember all those wise men. That was kind of the Chaldeans and the wise men and the astronomers and astrologers, all of that. Those were the men of the East. And so these men, they saw, it says, they saw his star. And you might ask yourself, how did they know it was his star? Was it just because they were so wise that they just knew? Or how would they know? Well, it's interesting. If we go back to the Old Testament, now we have a connection between a strange story in the Old Testament and a strange story in the New Testament. So if you go back to the book of Numbers, and here we have this prophecy in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a, what does it say? A star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Seth. So here is a prophecy of a star rising out of Jacob, metaphorically, not Jacob himself personally, but the land of Jacob, the land of the children of Israel. And who is it that is uttering this prophecy? Anyone? Balaam. Balaam is prophesying about the coming of Jesus and about his star, the ruler that would come out of Israel. Now, where was Balaam from? We have to go back another couple of chapters to find that. If you go back to chapter 22 of Numbers, chapter 22. So, let me just set the story for you. The children of Israel had come out of Egypt. You're all familiar with that story. God did many signs and wonders, basically just decimated Egypt. Egypt was the closest thing to a superpower that they had in those days, and it was just completely decimated. The 10 plagues, and then the whole army being drowned in the sea. They lost all their armor, their armies, Pharaoh himself, Pharaoh's son. There was, if you study Egyptian history, there's a lot of uncertainty what happened right there, because of course they always rewrote history to try to cover over the bad things that happened. And so there's some weird stuff in the historical record that coincides with this time. But the children of Israel, they came out of Egypt, and then what did they do for the next 40 years? We've been studying this in our Sabbath school lesson. They got stuck in the wilderness because they didn't have enough faith in God. When God brought them out and he was going to lead them in, and they got afraid, and they said they'd rather die in Egypt or the wilderness, and God said, okay, you can die in the wilderness if that's what you want. And so God gave them what they wanted, but he still guided them and provided for them and fed them and their children as they grew. And so now the children of Israel had grown even more numerous than they were when they came out of Egypt, and they're coming back to the promised land because God had told them, you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So there was a time limit, and they were coming back to the promised land. And if you look at chapter 21, it talks about how, for example, Sihon, the king of the Amorites, came out to oppose them, and what happened to the Amorites? They were destroyed. And then Og, the king of Bashan, he came out to oppose them. What happened to him? His kingdom was destroyed, and the Israelites occupied all the cities of these two nations, and God said, I have destroyed nations that are stronger than you so that you can take their land, and you're not even in the promised land yet. This is just the little warm-up. We're getting to the edge of the promised land. And so now the king of Moab looks, and his name is Balak, and he sees what's going on. He knows the story, and he knows that he's next. He was the next one in line, like his kingdom. And so he gathered together the experts and the leaders, the elders of Midian, and he said, hey, these people, I like the imagery here. Have you ever seen a cow eat grass? Have you ever actually watched how they do it? It's interesting. They use their tongue to, it's really weird if you actually sit and watch a cow eat grass. But like it says here, these people are going to, it says, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field, they're going to lick us up off the face of the earth. And so what was their response? Well, if there's a God who is doing magic for his people, then how do you counteract magic? You get better magic. And so they sent to the land of the east for Balaam. It says that the son of Beor of Pethor, and if you look for Pethor on your map, you probably won't find it, but scholars think that it's a town up along the Euphrates River. And here it says, Pethor, which is by the river, in the land of the children of his people. And so, there it is. Balaam was one of the wise men from the east. We don't know a whole lot about him prior to this, other than he must have had some reputation for being a wise man and a prophet of some kind, of having some connection with the supernatural, because this was a long way to send for someone back in those days. It's a few hundred miles across the desert, but back in the day you wouldn't go across the desert, you would go around, and you would ride on a animal of some kind that walks a few miles an hour. And so this was a long trip to go over there. And also, for those of you who are younger, you may not realize this, but they didn't have the internet back then, and they couldn't they couldn't just send an email and say, hey, we need you over here, I'll PayPal you the money, and you can fly in, curse these people for me, and then be home, fly back and be home for dinner. I mean, you could do that today. Literally, you could fly from the Euphrates River. You could fly over to Israel and fly back in one day, no big deal. But back then, it was a big deal. And so somehow his reputation had gotten out, and so they choose him. It says they sent the elders with rewards. In verse 7, the rewards of divination in their hand, and they came to Balaam, and they spake the words of Balak, and said, told him, look, all these people are come out, they're going to slaughter us, come and curse them, and save our people. And what was Balaam's reply? Verse 8. Balaam says, stay the night, and I will bring you word again, as the Lord shall speak unto me. And so they stayed. So Balaam, he did the right thing. He's like, hold a minute. I'm not going to give you an answer. Let me talk to God. Now, I don't know if Balaam already knew the answer at this point or not, but I kind of think maybe he did, but we don't know. But we do know he said, I'm going to see what answer God gives. And so what answer did God give? God said, no, you can't curse them. They're blessed. You can't curse people that I have blessed. And so in the morning, Balaam comes up, gives the answer, and verse 13, Balaam rose up in the morning. He said to the princes of Balak, go back home. The Lord refuses to allow me to go with you. And so what did Balak do? I know the names get a little confusing. It's Balaam and Balak and Baal-peor and Moab and Midianites and all that. But stay with me here. What happened next? A lot of you know the story already, but it's right there. You can follow along. They sent more and better, and they came back and offered him even greater honor and more money, and just said, if you'll just come and curse these people. And what was Balaam's reply in verse 18? He's still on the right track. In verse 18, he says to the servants, if Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. But go ahead and stay the night, and I'll see what God says. Now, do you detect a little something here? Like, I don't know. I see parents these days, sometimes. Maybe you've noticed this. Maybe this has even happened to you. when a child wants something, and they say, hey, can I have such and such? And the parent says no. And then 2 minutes later, the child is saying, can I please? And what's the answer? No. But sometimes, like if you keep begging long enough, mommy might change her mind. Maybe? I don't know. Though we're not going to get into a big parenting seminar here, except to say it's not really a good policy to change your mind if the children are whining and complaining. But anyway, is God like a parent? Well, he is. He's better than we are as a parent. Is God going to change his mind? He already said, no, you can't curse them because I've blessed them. Do you think Balaam really thought that God had changed his mind and now he's going to curse his people because there was more money involved? Like, does it really matter what the price is? Like, right is right and wrong is wrong. So here's one lesson for us. There's a lot of lessons in this strange story. Do the right thing regardless of the price. I mean, is that clear enough? When God tells you what to do and someone else wants to pay you to do something different, does it matter how much they have to give you? Should you even be having the discussion? Like if God has already told you no and you understand that. I mean, I understand is if you're not sure, but Balaam was sure. Like God spoke to him. He knew what the answer was. He didn't have to go and ask God. He already knew. He should have just said, hey guys, you want to learn about God? Let me tell you. Like he is a God who says, I am the Lord, I change not. And when I bless, my blessing is sure. And he could have given them a good sermon on that. And he could have told them, if they didn't want to be destroyed, that they could choose to worship God, and they could actually join the children of Israel. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was too late for them. Apparently it was. So you can read the story. We'll find that out. But he didn't do that. He got back into like, I can't go against God even if you give me a whole house full of gold, but that sounds pretty good. So wait a minute, let me talk to God and see if I can work something out with them. And so God says, if they come to call you in the morning, you may go with them. And then it says, Balaam got up early in the morning and went with them. I don't know if they called him or not. It doesn't really say in the verse right here. But now the story starts to get really interesting because God already told, like, Balaam knew he shouldn't go, right? But he goes, he saddles up his donkey and he takes 2 servants with him. So there's interesting that he had 2 servants. I don't know why that's interesting. It's just interesting. He wasn't alone. He wasn't a poor, like you look at the prophets in Israel, the prophets of God, they were pretty much always poor. But here, the poor prophet had 2 servants, and he was riding the donkey, and it says, verse 22, God's anger was kindled against him because he went. God made it clear, like, don't go. Don't go. But he did tell him, like, if you do go, you're only going to speak the words that I give you. So here's an interesting lesson in this. This story illustrates for us the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. God is sovereign. He will accomplish his purpose. And you still have a choice to mess up your own life. Got that? Like God's will be accomplished in this world somehow. And you can choose to cooperate or not. I mean, that's your choice. And so it says that God the Lord became angry at him. Interestingly, verse 22, look at it. It says, and God's anger was kindled because he went. And who was it that went out to meet him? The angel of the Lord. Who is the angel of the Lord? Mm-hmm. I've heard several answers. Everywhere in Scripture where it uses this phrase, the angel of the Lord, it refers to Jesus. Or in Daniel it says Michael, the archangel. That is mentioned once in the Old Testament, once in the New Testament. So, but the angel of this is the same angel of the Lord that went over Egypt and said, I will pass over. The same angel of the Lord that appeared to Moses in the burning bush and said that I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. So this angel, this messenger of God is Jesus. So it's Jesus who comes, and it says that he is against him, and the donkey, the ass, saw the angel of the Lord standing there with his sword drawn in his hand, and turned aside out of the way and went into a field, and Balaam smote the ass to turn her into the way. Now, do any of you ride donkeys on a regular basis, or even occasionally, just once? Like, donkeys are notoriously stubborn. They're fairly smart, I've heard, but they're smart enough to have their own mind and want to do their own thing. But so Balaam was quite upset. This donkey had never been like this before. It went off the path. And now here he is with his servants and all the highest, greatest princes of Moab, and he can't even keep his stupid donkey on the path. And so he beats the donkey and gets it back on the path. And this happens again. Verse 24, the angel of the Lord stood in a path of the vineyards. There was a wall on both sides, and he was standing there with his sword ready to kill Balaam, and the donkey saw him and went around him and crushed Balaam's foot on the wall. And Balaam got angry and beat the poor donkey again. And then a third time, this time it was such a narrow place, there was no place for the donkey to get around, and so the donkey just fell down on the ground. And Balaam just loses his mind. He starts beating the poor donkey, and it says the Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and she started talking to Balaam. What? What have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times? And Balaam, he's so angry, he doesn't even notice that it's unusual that the donkey is talking to him. And he starts talking back, like he's out of his mind, and he's talking to his donkey. I really wonder if the princes of Moab understood when the donkey was talking to Balaam. Can you imagine if you were there and you see this guy beating his donkey and the donkey starts talking to him, and you're thinking like, oh, like, yeah, well, I mean, what else would you expect for a wise man from the east? And that his donkey would talk to him and he would talk back to it. Like there's some sort of sorcery going on here. But Balaam didn't see Jesus. The donkey saw Jesus, but Balaam didn't. And it says, they have this conversation. Balaam says, I wish I had a sword, I would kill you now. And then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, verse 31, and Balaam saw the Lord standing there with his sword, and he fell down on his face, and the angel said, why have you beaten your donkey? Behold, I came out here to kill you because you are perverse. And if it hadn't been for your donkey, who saw me and turned out of the way, I would have killed you already. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but can you imagine Balaam thinking, Like, he just beat that poor donkey that saved his life. Isn't this a strange story? It's strange. And then try to put yourself in that situation right at that moment. What would have been the wise thing to do? Turn around and walk home. Like, let the donkey go. Walk home. And Balaam says, I have sinned. I didn't know that you were here to oppose me. Like, wait a minute. God told you not to go and that you could not curse them, and you chose to go anyway. Now, how would you not know that that you were working against God? But that's what he says. Oh, I'll go back if you're displeased. What? You couldn't tell that he was displeased? He's standing there with a sword saying, like, I would have killed you already if your donkey hadn't crushed your foot against the wall to get away from me. And I can just imagine Jesus, the angel of the Lord, just shaking his head. Like, really? Really? If I'm displeased, you'll go back? Like, whatever. Go ahead, go with them, he says. But only what I shall speak unto you, that thou shalt speak. And the thing is, Balaam somehow still didn't believe God. He still thought somehow he would be able to curse Israel and get all the prize money. But, see, this was Jesus asserting his sovereignty. God said, you will only speak the words that I put in your mouth. And we see indeed, they showed up, they went onto a high place, it says, that when Balaam arrived, they went to a high place. And the princes were there. They built 7 altars. Like verse 41. They brought him unto the high place of whom? Baal. Yeah. So here's a prophet of God who is going to try to curse God's people, and he goes to a high place that is a place to worship a pagan god, an idol. And he says, build 7 altars. They built 7 altars, and he sacrificed a bullock and a ram on each one. And Balaam said, now let me go talk to God, and I'll come again. And he came back, and he opened his mouth, and what happened? A blessing came out of his mouth. And the king was angry, and Balaam said, well, I told you I can only say what God tells me. And he's like, well, let's go to a different place. Maybe a different place where you can just see part of them, and maybe that'll work. So they did this 3 times. 3 times. And every time he opened his mouth and a blessing came out. And so again, we get back to the end of the story. In chapter 24, Balak's anger, chapter 24, verse 10, Balak's anger was kindled against Balaam. He smote his hands together, and he said, I called thee to curse mine enemies, and behold, thou hast altogether blessed them these 3 times. Now get back to your place. And Balaam says, I told your people all I could do is what God said. Even if you give me a whole house full of gold and silver, whatever God says, that's what I can speak. And then, verse 15 starts this additional blessing and messianic prophecy of the star that would rise out of Jacob. And so we come to the end of the story, and it says that Balaam rose up and went and returned to his place. But that's not the end of the story. See, this was God exercising his sovereignty. And Balaam was trying to win the prize money and curse God's people, but he couldn't. Literally, he opened his mouth and a blessing came out. He could not speak the words of a curse upon Israel. And we see Balaam riding away, but what's the next part of the story? Well, the next part of the story, it tells us that this happened in Baal Peor, verse 3 of chapter 25. What happened was that as Israel was camped out there, they started to mingle with the people from Moab. And some of the girls came down from Moab to Israel and started a little, they were just hanging out, had a little party, having a good time, and it turned into a mess. It was a big fiasco where the men of Israel were getting together with the women of Moab, and it says that they were also worshiping Baal. And ended up that it says that the Lord, verse 9, the Lord sent a plague, and 24,000 of the men of Israel died in the plague. Here's the sad part of the story. I mean, that's pretty sad. Turn to the book of Revelation. Revelation, chapter 2. And here we have the messages to the 7 churches. And right in the middle of chapter 2, we have the angel of the church of Pergamos. And Jesus has this message for the church of Pergamos. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of whom? Balaam. Oh, what is the doctrine of Balaam? There's nowhere else in the Bible where it explains what the doctrine of Balaam is. But what does it say? That he taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. So in the book of Numbers, it doesn't tell us about that part of the story. It just makes it sound like Balaam rides away and that's the end, and then the next thing, Israel gets into all this trouble. But here we're told it's actually Balaam's idea that he gave. He told Balak, look, I can't curse Israel, but you can get them to bring a curse on themselves. And the way to do it is with, getting them involved in pleasure seeking that's outside of the will of God. And it worked like a charm. So there we have Balaam. He was determined to get the reward somehow. Apparently he got some kind of reward. Unfortunately, we don't know the end of Balaam's life, how he turned out. There's all these stories in the Bible where we don't have all the details. Okay. So there's some details that are missing. In any case, what a sad ending for someone that was supposed to be a prophet. That kind of rhymes with the last story we talked about, doesn't it? A prophet who didn't follow God's directions and Didn't end up well. But even so, this is amazing. Even so, God used Balaam to give this messianic prophecy, and it was preserved somehow by the wise men in the east. And all those generations later, the Lord brought them to study the prophecies and to recognize the star and to come to worship Jesus. So what's our take-home lessons out of this? Well, when God tells you something, just accept it. Don't keep asking for him to change his mind. Just take the first answer and just go with that. Okay? And realize, like, if you keep pushing, like, you can get your way eventually, but you're not going to change God's way. And you can leave the path, or you can stay on the path. That's up to you. But the blessing of God is still going to fall on the people that he blesses. And our choice is, do we want to join and be under that blessing, or do we want to go out on our own and then there's another warning here, which I don't know if it will do us any good or not. And that is, when your donkey starts talking to you, you should pause right there, because something's going on, right? This happens all through Scripture, where people that are opposing God, they have strange things happen to them that normally should make them stop and turn around and do something different, but they keep on, just like Balaam did, right? He just kept on. There's so many stories in the Bible like that. But pay attention to what's going on around you, right? We call it the divine providence of God, the way he works things out in the world. When strange things are happening, like, pay attention. And maybe if you listen the first time, then you won't end up having an argument with your donkey. Yes? Yeah. Well, I mean, he was trying to catch up with them, so that's interesting little detail, yeah. It's sort of implied in the text here, although it's not explicitly stated. So, yeah, don't argue with your donkey. Much better to be one of the wise men from the east who comes to worship, instead of one of the wise men from the east who comes to try to get the reward and curse God's people. What a contrast. What a contrast. So our closing hymn today is going to be We Three Kings, because it fits with the story, and it's Christmas time. So, be one of the actual wise men and not one of the wise guys that argues with your donkey. Okay? All right. It's hymn number 137. And I'll invite you to stand with